All right, so we're very fortunate to have Kirk Munro tonight to give us an intro on PowerShell debugging. Kirk, take it away.
Thanks. I appreciate you guys inviting me. Actually, your location, Gainesville, I've been to a couple of times, not to your user group, but just to Gainesville, the city, because I've gone there for, you guys have a really fancy high-tech recording studio for doing videos and really neat backdrops. And so I've gone there and I've done some sessions for previous conferences that were online only, recording out of that studio. And also, of course, you guys have the scripting guy and scripting wife there. I don't know if they've ever been to your user group or not. If your user group's too new for them, since Ed's retired now. But anyway, Gainesville's a cool place, and wanted to get a chance to get back there. I'd like to, but unfortunately, Florida's a little bit far for a regular visit for me. So my name's Kirk Munro, and I've been going by the handle Poshaholic since PowerShell came out in 2006. Generally, my background is I was a software developer, and I was working on some low-level APIs and MAPI and LDAP, and working with Active Directory and Exchange. And then I saw some PowerShell presentations during the Exchange 12 Airlift, and that just really grabbed my attention in terms of the consistency and discoverability, and so I thought I would redirect my career over this thing. And the bulk of my career, not all of it, but the bulk of my career since then has been focused just on PowerShell. I think in the invite to this, it said that I'm a PowerShell MVP. Technically, I'm not a PowerShell MVP right now, because when it came time earlier this year for me to submit when you're an MVP, every year you have to submit a record of what you do, just so Microsoft can review it, make sure that you should still be an MVP. I caught pneumonia right around the time that was due. And so I asked for an extension, and they couldn't give me an extension because it's an automated system that they couldn't stop from going through. And so I have to reapply to become an MVP again. I'm going through that process right now. I find it's kind of ironic that I automated myself out of the MVP process, because it's all an automatic system that happens behind the scenes, and so they couldn't stop it. But I still love automation, and I still have PowerShell, and so I'm going through the process to try to get rewarded MVP again. But regardless, I still like talking to the community about PowerShell and what you can do with it. And the debugger is a particular area of interest that I spend a lot of time in, and I've done a lot of presentations on it. And I like talking to folks about it because a lot of people still don't use the debugger much. Now, I can see through the camera, the room a little bit, but maybe just, I'm curious how many people in the room are already using the debugger, setting breakpoints, stepping through code, all that sort of thing today. No hands?
We got one.
Okay, that's good. So this is the right talk for you guys then, because this is about getting you guys into that fold. And for the one of you who already are doing it, some of this might be review, but hopefully you'll get some new content, other things you can do in the debugger as I go through the content. I want to keep this casual, so interrupt anytime with questions, anything specific about stuff you've tried or things you find hard to debug, so that can kind of guide me for where I should go with this. I've done talks similar to this that I call more ninja level talks, where I kind of just go hardcore through an hour and a half of debugging content, but I want this to be a lot more relaxed and a lot more interactive. So please chime in if you guys do have any questions about this. Also, right now, I'm just using the PowerShell console, and I mean, I'll use a little bit of PowerShell ISE as well, but this is just using PowerShell console with Windows PowerShell 5.1 at the moment. I'll talk a little bit about PowerShell 7 and debugging changes that are coming going forward, but this doesn't really matter, but is it a fair assumption that most of you guys are using Windows PowerShell 5.1 today?
Yeah, I think.
Okay. Even if you're not, the stuff I'm doing will apply for lower versions down to level versions 2 and later, because that's when they added the debugger was in PowerShell version 2, but not necessarily everything I show will work in that version, or the down level versions. So the first things first is, also if you guys want to contact me anytime, you can find me on Twitter with my handle Poshaholic, or you can find me on GitHub, and the GitHub projects I work on are all under my name, Kirk Munro. So What to start with? Well, the first thing to start with is just, I guess, starting with errors, right? And so if you're dealing with errors in PowerShell, actually, let me just load up a bunch of errors. So I've got a script here to just load up a bunch of errors. So, actually, that's not the one. Sorry, wrong script. So all this script here does, all I'm trying to do is basically prime the pump. So this is just loading up a whole bunch of errors into PowerShell. It's going to load 20 of them, so my error collection is not empty. So when you're dealing with PowerShell and you're dealing with scripting, and you run some script, you'll generally get back, actually, I'm going to run it again. You'll generally get back a lot of errors. And sometimes you can look, now that only did just the one. Where did that only do the one? Oh no, that did them all. Okay, so that only showed one error. Behind the scenes, this actually generated 20 errors for various things. Some errors are terminating, some errors are non-terminating. And so what you see when you run a script might just look like a simple error. There might be a whole lot of things happen behind the scenes depending on how the script is written, and you need to figure out how you can get to the bottom of that easily. And so you get this collection of errors, right? So let's say I just ran this command, I get back to this error, but get process not working. And so I want to figure out what's going on. So I want to look into that particular error message. So I can look at error, the collection, and I can see there's actually 20 errors and a lot of stuff flies by in a real hurry there, which is less helpful. Ignore the fact that there are some duplicates, because that's done intentionally. You can actually parse the error collection and make it a lot easier to read than just by using $error by itself. So the error variable is an actual array. And if you look at the index 0 item in that array, that's the last error that happened. So that'll always be the most recent error. You need to be, when you're dealing with error 0 on a regular basis, it's easy to make a mistake on the command line. So, and then your error 0 is no longer error 0, it's now error 1 or error 2, because it'll always get pushed down. Errors are always added to the front of this collection. So I might look at error 0 dot and try to find some property that actually let me do something that does not exist. This is just a method that does not exist. My point is just to cause another error to happen. And since I caused another error to show up in the system, when I go to error 0, I now get that last error that I had. So if I was troubleshooting and I was working with a particular error, I need to be aware that I'm referencing a count, and that count's going to change if I cause additional errors to happen as I'm troubleshooting. So a good idea is to capture the error that you want to work with in a variable, so that if you get another error that shows up, 1 divided by 0, just because you make some typo or you do something that didn't work, you still have the same error that you're working with and that you're troubleshooting. So I usually capture one or a couple of errors inside of an error variable, and then just take a look at those on a regular basis. That way you don't have to worry about the churn from additional errors that can show up. Now, errors, this is just text on the screen, and understanding how to read this is important, because it will guide you, or it'll also guide users of your scripts, if you're sharing scripts in your environment, a long way to figuring out what happened. The unfortunate part is that the majority of our errors are red text with a squiggly line, and they show some line numbers and some developer-like things. And so I've seen a number of occasions where a very seasoned admin will take something that I gave them that's PowerShell, and they'll run it, and they get a problem, and they come over to my desk and tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, I need your help with something. Your script didn't work. And so I go over and I look at their screen, and it says very, very, very clearly on the screen why the script didn't work. But they didn't even read the text because it was red. And so the color is a very small detail, but when it's red and it looks like developer code, a lot of them are like, oh, this is a problem with the script, and so the developer's going to know how to do that, so I'll go get the developer and get him to help me out. So one thing I tell people on a regular basis is to, it's a really, really simple thing, but it's just to change your color. of your error message. So if you're in regular PowerShell, host.privatedata.error, the foreground color, and maybe I want to make it cyan. Oops, equals. And now if I go get that same error again, now I'm going to get a different color. And it sounds so silly, and I've presented this again and again and again to different groups, and it does make a huge difference for yourself as well, for yourselves as well as for people who are using your content if the error messages are showing up in a different color. The PowerShell team recognizes this, and they're actually trying to reduce the red in the error messages going forward so that people don't get confused or distracted by the color and actually see text on the screen that tells them something and try to make that text more front and center so they can read it. So, but changing the color is a silly thing, but it's important. And you can change the color different ways inside of the PowerShell host than in ISE, than in Visual Studio Code. But the point is that you can actually change the color to make your life a little easier and throw in your profile script and then just work with the PowerShell in a bit more friendly way. Now, moving beyond the color, I want to get into actually debugging. So today, in PowerShell 5.1 and earlier, and in PowerShell 6.2 as well, if you get an error after the fact, so you run some script and it's going to go and produce some error, you're working after the error happened and trying to get back to where the error came from. So let's go back to my E variable that I grabbed earlier. So I've got get directory name. There's this call, right? System IO path get directory name null. Where's that come from? Well, this gives me some information. It tells me line 10, character 21 of the actual command that I wrote. So this kind of points me out to where that call is coming from. And then it gives me some text that tells me what happened. And so if I go back to, now this was just ad hoc, but if it was a script file, it would also give me the script file name. So if you're running scripts, it'll tell you script file, my script.ps1, line 10, character 21. And so you can go look at the contents. And if I count down here, line 10, character 21 is right here. And that's tells me right where the error came from. So that's a great start. You also might want to look at additional error details, but when you have errors and you pipe them to, like if you're working with PowerShell, you're dealing with objects. If you want to pipe that to format list star to see more details, it just gives you the exact same thing. Format table, the same thing. And the reason why is because in PowerShell, in every version of PowerShell up to current, including the latest version 7 previews, although I'm trying to get this changed to version 7, it's hard-coded with a specific format that you can't change unless you force it. And so if you actually want to see the object data for errors, and I could do this on one error like I did here, or I could do this on an entire collection, error, like your format list star, that'll give me all of the details of all the errors. That gives me back details with properties, and that gives me the exception information. And so I can also look at the exception, because errors, when you run errors in your scripts, they generally come from exceptions or from parse errors. And so if I look at the exception, that gives me something that came from actually from .NET, because PowerShell is built in .NET. Commands go into calls in .NET, those produce exceptions, and those exceptions get wrapped in errors in PowerShell, and then we get to see those errors. And so, again, that's a short text form. If I want to see the details, I can do format list star, but I need to use force again because of this is just something that they hard-coded in a long time ago. Not entirely sure why it's hard-coded to be there all the time. I have a PR submitted for PowerShell 7 that makes it so that you don't have to use force and you'll get back the information that you would expect. But in all the versions that are out there today, you have to force this stuff. So you just get used to using it. So exceptions give you additional information and sometimes can contain inner exceptions. And inner exceptions can contain other inner exceptions. Because when you're dealing with code, doesn't matter if it's a PowerShell script or a compiled program, errors can have a stack, because you can have one error inside of something that's 3 or 4 levels deep that gets raised, and then somebody catches it and it causes an error at their level, and so they wrap it in that exception, and then it gets wrapped, and then it gets wrapped. So there are cases where you have an error that gets wrapped several levels deep, and to get to the details of what actually happened, you need to go into the inner exception. And I don't have a specific example, but there are cases where just looking at the error, I didn't have a clue what was going on. By going into error.exception.inner exception.inner exception.inner exception, you know, you can go as many levels deep as the actual exception stack goes. It depends on the case of the error, but I had to go several levels deep to get the inner exception, the first thing that caused the problem, and that text told me exactly what the problem was. Non-ambiguous, no trying to figure it out. It told me exactly what was wrong, but I couldn't see that until I peeled back the onion to get to it. So it's important to understand when you get errors, you start by looking at the outer message, see if that tells you what's going wrong or not. If not, then you can go inside the exception and check if there's inner exceptions, see if those messages, because every exception has a message, see if those exception details tell you more information to point to what was going on, and try to troubleshoot the problem that way. That's totally unrelated, not related to the debugger at all. That's just about general troubleshooting skills when you get these issues showing up. Now, the other thing you could do, instead of trying to peel back the onion from the outside after the fact, is you run some script and you get an error, and the error tells you, you know, what line number and what character number it happened on. So you could go and put a breakpoint in your script and then rerun it. And when you're on that breakpoint, look around and see what's going on. So I'm actually just going to open up ISE. Curious about how much of the room is using Visual Studio Code and how much of the room is using PowerShell ISE still, or both?
Mostly code for me. Yeah.
Okay.
We've got a pretty good mix in the room.
Okay, I use both. ISE, I still use a lot when I'm on Windows just because it's a muscle memory. I've been using it for many years. It's easier for me just to do that rather than to go into code and figure things out. But I also do PowerShell on Mac and Linux, in which case I use code in those environments because that's all that I have. Most of the time though, I mean, even irrespective of code and ISE, I'll use those to look at files, but I'll just use the PowerShell console myself and just work at the command line on a regular basis. Just because I find knowing how to do things at that level makes it easier, because then if I'm remoting to a system or in some environment where I can't have access to an editor, I have the skills to work with it consistently on a regular basis. But I'm glad that you guys still use, that you guys do use both, and I expected there were still some people using ISE, because even though they say that we're supposed to use Visual Studio Code a lot, Visual Studio Code is a lot different from ISE. It takes a while to get used to, and if ISE is doing a job, there's no real driver for you to stop using it other than to ramp up for cross-platform PowerShell with code. I mean, yes, there isn't. I say there's no reason. ISE isn't only going to have critical fixes at this point. They're not doing development in it, but it still is a good featured editor. So why not use it? So I'm just going to go and open. Let's see, where did I put this? There it is, debugging, and then intro, and then I want to open up number 1. So I've got the script file here. This is not the same as the one I just ran, that script that generates errors, but this is just a script that has 3 functions. I've got function A, which calls function B, which calls function C. And so I can set a breakpoint inside of ISE, and you can do this in code as well, just by going to the line where you want to have the breakpoint and pressing F9. There's many options for it as well, but F9 is a standard toggle breakpoint shortcut in development tools. And that's the most common breakpointing that people do, I think, is just going to the line that they want to stop to see what's going on. And so let's say that I was looking at a call to get directory name. Yeah, actually, sorry, this has the same example of the error that was showing up. So get directory name null. So when I run this, if I run it without the breakpoint first, and it runs it, oh yeah, that's right. So it runs it, tells me it's about to get the directory name, and then it's done. And so I don't know what's going on and why it stopped. All I know is that it didn't get the directory name. So this is a very common scenario where people put in write host or text output commands in their scripts, write information if they want to use that version instead of PowerShell to show progress, and something's going on, and so I get the first message, but I didn't get the second message. And this goes to a lot, years and years and years of people doing debugging in environments where they can't necessarily set breakpoints. And so what do? You throw in text messages and you just see how far it gets and then try to figure out what's going on. So I can see that it gets here, but then something happens. It doesn't call the second message. And so if I want to see what's going on, I can put my breakpoint on that line, that I know it gets to, and I can rerun my script by hitting F5 again. And now, I don't know if you can tell on your screen, but the color for this breakpoint marker changed slightly to more of a brownish color. And I can see right here in the command line, I hit a line breakpoint on the actual file, and it tells me what line I'm on, line number 9. And so that's visual debugging inside of an editor where you push F, where you can hit F9, you hit a breakpoint, and you get into the debugger. But now what? I'm in the debugger, and I want to figure out what's going on. I know that it fails after this about to get directory name text shows up. So I want to step to the next, I want to keep on stepping to the script until I actually see what happens with the script to make sure that I understand what the sequence of execution is. So if I step over this command, so under debug, there's 3 commands that you're going to want to get familiar with when you're debugging. There's step over, step into, and step out. These are how you control what you're looking at in the debugger and what's going to run next. Well, it's not what's going to run next, but what the debugger is going to stop on next. So if I hit, if I use step over, which is F10, it will step over the current command. Even if it's a function that I have a lot of code for, and it's a function maybe I wrote, it's going to step over that function and go to the next line following that particular line that I'm on. If I use step into, it's going to step into the function or into the command that I'm on if it's able. In this case, I'm calling write host. Write host is a compiled command. I can't step into it, so step into will act as step over when it cannot step into the function or the command. And then the other one is step out. And step out is something that you would use when you step in something and you realize, oh, I didn't mean to step into that. And so you want to just basically skip over the rest of the code in that function you stepped into, or that script file you stepped into, and you want to go back one level to what you were debugging before that, the line. So I'll show you those 3 things. So step over is just F10, and so I can go to my next line, and now it's going to call get directory name, and I hit F10. Oh, it didn't go to the next line. So aside from when I'm going through the troubleshooting process, I look at the error messages, like I showed you, try to understand what's going on at that point. Then I'm going to go into the debugger, and I'm going to try to figure out what's going on at that point. And that might be going into the debugger and looking at stuff programmatically, or just putting a breakpoint like this and stepping through the code to see the execution, to see if there's any surprises, so I can see where things failed. And so I know it jumps over this line I wanted it to get here, line 11, but I know it jumped over it. I can see it's already gone down all the way to line number 25. If I'm a little lost in terms of where it is for whatever reason, the debugger has built-in commands that you can access by typing in help or hitting H. And it's got these commands like step into, step over, and step out with shortcuts S, V, and O. It also has list, and so you can actually look at the current script that you're running, and it'll show you with a little star what line you're on. So even though the visual debugging is great, I can see inside of here what's going on. That marker is good enough that I can see it. But when you're not in the visual debugger, you still have tools to show you where are you in your files. So that's why I do my debugging from PowerShell, because I can leverage this stuff and I can take a look around and see what the actual script lines that I'm executing look like and what line I'm on at any time that I need to. But so that was just me stepping over, so I could see there's a problem, and I jumped out of the function, and so this get directory name raises an error, but I didn't even get to see that error. And the reason why I didn't get to see that error, well, I need to look up the stack to see what happened. So C is called by B, and it doesn't do anything, but B is called by A, and when it's called by A, it's called inside of a try-catch block. And so try catch is used to provide error handling. But in this case, in my catch block, so try basically says, okay, try doing these lines of script that I have in my code. And if something comes up, if an exception is thrown, I want you to catch it. And you can do a naked catch like this, which doesn't have a particular exception type, or you can also catch with a specific type of exception if you want to do focused error handling for an exception type. In practice, what I've done here is something you should almost never do, because an empty catch block like this swallows all the errors. So the error gets raised here in C, it propagates back up to B, which PowerShell sees, okay, it doesn't have any error handling. So it goes back to A. Eventually it would get back to the host and I would see it, but inside of A, the error was thrown inside a try block, it gets caught, nothing is done with it, so the error is thrown away, and then the function continues execution at the end. And so if I hit F10 again, my function finishes, and I didn't get the error message. And so my problem is this catch block. So what I should do is, if I'm doing some handling code inside of here, I might have some conditional logic, like, you know, if $underbar, that's the actual exception that gets caught, and do some conditional work, and then whatever that happens to be. And then otherwise, else, I'm putting that in comments because I'm not going to run that way. Else, I might want to have it just rethrow. But if I can just get a dollar sign underbar and I have some exception that's allowed, something specific I want to allow, maybe I continue execution. That says basically don't throw anything. I just want to continue execution. But if not, then throw the exception. And how do you rethrow an exception inside of a catch block? You just invoke throw. You don't have to put anything after it. You don't have to put $underbar. You actually don't want to put $underbar. You just want to use throw by itself, which basically says take this exception that you caught and rethrow it, so because I'm not handling it, and it can be handled elsewhere. Now that I've done that, if I remove my breakpoint and I run my script, I actually get the error message, and so I can see what's going on. So be wary of naked catches that don't do anything, or catches that don't rethrow, because if they're handling something, if they're being too zealous in how they handle errors, it'll stop you from troubleshooting your problems very easily, and it'll hide errors that you don't want to have hidden inside of your code. Now, take that back out again. Let me rerun the script, and this time I'm just going to hit my breakpoint on the first line. And so if I rerun this one more time, and I'm going to show you the other commands that I mentioned in the debugger. So I can step into A. So I'm on line A right here. And if I hit F10, which is step over, it just runs to completion and it's all done. Because I stepped over A. I didn't want to go inside and do any further debugging. So it's going to run everything inside of A. If I have a breakpoint in something that A calls, and I rerun the script, and I'm on my breakpoint, and I hit F10, or in this case, just to make it more visual, debug step over, it tries to step over, but it sees, oh, there's a breakpoint. So I'm actually going to stop you on that breakpoint. And at that point, maybe I want to just get out of there. And so, actually, let me do a better example. Same script. I'm just going to comment out that error line. Let's say there was no error. And so there's a breakpoint at this line instead. So I run my script and I hit the first breakpoint. Then I want to step over F10. Oh, I forgot I had that breakpoint set up in C from earlier. I don't need that anymore. So I can, while I'm debugging even, I can turn that breakpoint off. So there's now no breakpoint on line 9. And then I can do step out because I want to get back to where I was. So debug, step out. That gets me out of C back into B. I want to get back to where I was. Debug, step out, back into A. Debug, step out, back in my command line, and I'm done. So that's where you're going to use step out, is when you sometime end up a couple levels deep in code you didn't mean to be, and you want to back out the stack a little bit. You can use Shift F11 or debug step out to actually step out. Questions so far? Okay, so Let me put this back the way that it was with the error message there. Now, that's line breakpoints. I also want to show you the core functionality of the debugger that you can use from the regular command line. So let me clear my screen here. And I'm just going to call a command. Now, this is a command that comes in the module that I've written called breakpx. Oh, sorry, no, debugpx. There's a function. There's a module. If you run install module named debugpx, I'm not actually going to do it because I have installed already. That'll install this helper module on your system that I wrote for earlier versions of PowerShell to make debugging a little bit easier. I'm actually just going to control C that because install module is crazy slow. But that will get the module installed. I already have it installed. And so I'm just going to load it. And so debugpx, it gives you a few commands to help with the debugging experience in down-level versions of PowerShell. So in version 7 and later, I'm trying to make it so that this module is not necessary at all, and trying to push the functionality I have in here in PowerShell core so that it's native and everybody gets it without having to install a module to get it. But in down-level versions of PowerShell, you have to install this module if you want to do these things. So I have this command called enter debugger, which is very similar to PowerShell's wait debugger, except for one key difference. In PowerShell version 5.1 and earlier, if I run wait debugger, it doesn't seem like it does anything. And that's because, well, unless you use it inside of a script that has additional lines of code. Wait debugger in PowerShell version 5.1 and earlier will tell PowerShell, I want to enter a debug breakpoint right here, right now, but it actually doesn't do it on that line, it actually does it on the next line. And so when you run it by itself, there's nothing to do. But if you run it with something after it, it'll break on that next line. Now, that bugged me, and so so I wrote enter debugger. Actually, I was doing this. I wrote enter debugger and the debugpx module at around the same time that the PowerShell team was adding the wait debugger functionality to version 5. And so enter debugger stops on the actual line. So it's a small difference, but enter debugger also, let me quit, also gives me some conditional support. So let's say x is 2, and I want to enter my debugger when x is greater than 4. And so it gives me conditional support. And I can throw this into my scripts if I'm debugging and I want to break conditionally on a line. I mean, there's other ways you can do conditions too. But visually, I can just type this into a line in my script and it'll just break on that line if that condition is true. And so that didn't break. But if I do x equals 5 and I run that again, now I hit that breakpoint because the condition passed. So debugpx is a helper module for down-level systems to make debugging easier. But what I was trying to get to was just being in the debugger. I've hit some breakpoint, and so I want to know what I can do. I showed you this. This is just using PowerShell native shell, or maybe you're in some remoting session. Maybe you're attached in a job that's running on your system, and you're at this debugger, the command line prompt, less visual, and you want to see what's going on. You can look around with L. And actually, that's I'm going to, let me think. I want to do that same, I'm going to show you the experience for the actual commands from this window, because this one I have an actual script file that I can run, and I'll put a breakpoint to get me into the breakpoint and show you what it looks like when you look around. But these are the same commands. These are the same commands that I use when I do my debugging inside of my shell. So let me go full screen on. I want to get the script green going. Nope, that's not the one. There we go. I want full screen console. So if you're in a PowerShell environment and you don't have the scripts visible to you and you want to see what's going on when you're on a breakpoint, you can use the L command, which is one of, it's basically a list. Shows you a file listing of a subsection of the file, and shows you, I talked about this earlier, the star showing you the current line where you actually are in the file for debugging. If I step, now that actually, because I'm using Visual Studio, or sorry, PowerShell's ISE, it's showing me what's going on inside of my file at the same time, but I just want to focus on the console. If I look around again, I can see I stepped to line 25. And so if I step again, I will finish the execution of this and finish my execution of my script entirely. But I can see line by line, each time I step, I can use L to look around and see what's going on. And L is actually a pretty helpful command because you can do more than just one line. So if you look up this list of commands, I talked about stepping and the shortcuts for those. So S is step into, V is over, O is out. You can type in the long commands if you want to, if you don't remember the shorthand, but getting to know the shorthand is worth it. And so I just use these shorthand commands. When you use L and you don't see the whole file, like in this case, I can indicate I want to see more. So if you notice in this help window, it tells you I can start from line M and go to line N. And so let's say I want to start from line 1 and go to, well, I don't know how big the file is I'm in. And so I just want to show up to 100 lines. I can actually get a full file listing and see where I am in the file. So it's really helpful for figuring out where I am and what's going on. And at any point when I'm in the debugger, I can look around and see what's going on. So I'm going to continue execution here and go to my other breakpoint. So when I'm looking at a particular error and I want to check some variable, if you notice, I've got x equal to 3 here, but I can check the value of x programmatically and I can change it. And so this is actual real-time changes that I can apply to my execution as I'm testing things. And before running a line, I can take that line and I can try it. And so I can either step through the code, at which point it's run that line and it won't run that line again, or I can take sections of that code and copy and paste it and run it inside of my shell to see what it's going to do before the script actually does it, so I can get a better idea of what's going on and do troubleshooting. Look at my variables, check the modules that I have that are loaded. I can also look at a thing called PS debug context when I'm on a breakpoint, and I can see with my context what breakpoints did I hit. So in this case, I hit a line breakpoint on line 10 in this hard skills file. I can also look at the invocation info, and I can see some of the details about the position of where it actually hit that file and the file name itself, and if the command came from internal or external, when it was called, if it was expecting any input. There's just useful parameters here because sometimes you're going to hit a breakpoint, you're going to enter the debugger by accident inside of PS read line, or maybe in your prompt function, or inside a code that doesn't belong to you. And so figuring out what your context is by looking at PS debug context and by looking at the current line by showing your file listings using L, that'll help you figure out, oh, did I want to be in here? No, this isn't my stuff. Let me step out of this and get back to my own code. But the easiest way to get familiar with debugging is to just create some simple little file. I mean, this is really simple, and I've got this shared up on GitHub. This is just running a couple of functions and setting some breakpoints and seeing what happens when you actually step through your code and trying to troubleshoot and see what goes on. Now, that when you come up here and you hit F9, right, just at a breakpoint, that's line breakpointing. There are other breakpoints that are really powerful that can save you a lot of time if you're careful about how to use them. One of them is command breakpoints. So I can do, there's get command now PS breakpoint. PowerShell does everything using using internal APIs, and some of those internal APIs are exposed via. Now why is that not running? I'm going to switch over just to save some time. I don't know why. What's up with ISE? So there are commands in PowerShell for managing breakpoints. There's actual commandlets, and the commandlets, there's just 5 of them, right? So getting breakpoints to see what breakpoints are set, removing them, setting them. When you do things like hitting F9, it calls these guys, and it actually uses them. So if I can. No, my ISE is toasted. Okay, there it worked. Yeah, it's working then. I don't know why that hung. Anyway, so you can take a look at the breakpoints that you have set at any time using get ps breakpoint or just get gbp for short. BP is the shorthand for any ps breakpoint command for the suffix. And so if you know your prefix shortcuts like G or R, M, or I forget which one now, I have to double check. I don't use the remove one programmatically that much unless I'm removing them all. S is for set. Those are going to be able to make things a little bit faster for you from the command line if you know the shorthands aliases. But what I was trying to get at is the second type of breakpoint you can use, and this is the one I use probably the most frequently, more so the line breakpoints, is set command breakpoints. And so I set a breakpoint here on the write host command, and what this means is anytime that I run write host, I'm going to hit a breakpoint and it'll stop. So even though there's nothing visual up here, if I hit F5 to run this, it stops on the write host command before the command actually runs. And so I can use that as a way to get to a specific point inside of my scripts faster without doing a visual breakpoint if I know there's some problem with a certain command. Because when you're dealing with errors, like what I showed you over here, I'm just going to try to find the right guy. Is it 2? No, it's older than that. Here it is. So this is an error on a command. The command get process through an issue. So maybe I just want to stop on get process. And so rather than go figure out where get process is inside of which script file when this happened and try to set a breakpoint and get back to it that way, I can just use set ps breakpoint - command get process and then rerun my script, and I'll hit a breakpoint on the get process command, just like I did here with write host. And so these are great for getting to a location quickly. They can also get you into other locations depending on the command you set the breakpoint on, because this is unscoped. This is just any invocation of write host. I didn't tell it write host in a particular script file. I can do that because I can actually set breakpoint and also set the script file. And so I could do / debugging and then intro and then hard skills. And so that's going to set a breakpoint on the write host command only when it's invoked from this particular script file. But I don't often want to type in the commands, and so I usually try to just scope things out quickly by typing the actual script files. I usually don't want to think about that too much. I just want to say, okay, give me a breakpoints wherever this command is called, and I try to be as precise as I can with the command that I'm going to stop on, something that's going to take me to my location I'm trying to get to fastest, and then I just get into the debugger and I can look around and I can start stepping through code. So in this case, where I stop on write host, and I know that it's close enough to where I had my error, then I can just step, and now on the next line, okay, I'm about to get the directory name, step, and I hit the issue that it threw an exception and threw me up the stack. A surefire way also of knowing when you hit an exception is if you try to step and your cursor doesn't go to the next line. And you're like, what happened? Well, it threw an exception. That's the only reason it's going to jump you up somewhere else. If it didn't throw an exception, it's going to always go to the next line. So only when it runs into some terminating error, not non-terminating error, right? If this was a non-terminating error, there are two different types. Non-terminating errors can happen for things that are a little bit more benign, but for terminating errors, it's going to actually be treated as an exception and throw you to a different location. And so you'll see the cursor jump. 1 second. So going back to the debugger commands, I encourage you to try playing with these, get familiar with AR. Oh, this is a good one to know too, get PS call stack. When you're dealing with a command that invoked another command, and that invoked another command, and you want to see what's going on, you can look at the call stack. So in this case, let me get back to my original breakpoint again one more time. I'm in function C, which was invoked by B, which was invoked by A, and I can read that here. But if these were across multiple files and I wanted to see, well, how did I get to this point? I can look at the call stack by invoking K or get-ps call stack. It's the same thing. And that shows me where I am in the current file, which is on Command C, and Command C was invoked by B was invoked by A, and A is in hardskills.ps1. And so the call stack's useful for figuring out how did I get to where I am right now when this error happened. One key reason why things like call stack and getting to the error quickly are good skills to practice now is because when you get into something like PowerShell 7, which is only in preview 4 right now, there's new functionality that makes it a lot easier without setting breakpoints to get to the bottom of what's going on in your scripts. Because let's say inside of here, I run this exact same command, but I'm going to just do it from the command line. So I'm going to do that, and then intro, and then, so I'm going to run that script file that has that error in it. And when I do that, oh, did I comment the thing out? Yes, I have it commented out, don't I? Constructor game null. Did it actually run through in PowerShell 7? Now that's, I'm looking at that now with my head cocked to one side like a puppy because I got confused because I think that's actually a bug in PowerShell preview that I just tripped on because the message shouldn't show up. Oh, I know why. No, I don't know why, because I got all the changes I made I've undone. And so I've got a raw error, that's an exception, and I'm not debugging it anymore. Yeah, that's a bug. So aside from a bug showing up, I'm gonna run this one more time. Error action preference. Continue. Yeah, that's definitely a bug. Sorry for the distraction. I just tripped a bug in PowerShell 7 preview 4 that I need to figure out what's going on because that shouldn't be. But what normally can happen, so let me do it this way. I'm just going to run some arbitrary code. Imagine this is me running some code that's inside of a script file. And inside of that file, you know, I'm just going to throw in some commands that do arbitrary things, and then I'm going to throw in an error. And so that process doesn't exist, and then more things afterwards. And so when I run this, I get an error. So that's what I was trying to get to the point where I run some command, and it gives me back an error. And I want to figure out, okay, well, what happened in my command? If this was an actual advanced function, whoops, like this. So when you're dealing with functions that people have created inside of modules, which are usually advanced functions, and hopefully most of the functions you write are advanced functions because they give you useful functionality like what I'm going to show you, you can get to the bottom of what's going on more quickly by running, actually, I'm talking about advanced functions, I might as well give it a function name. So let's say this is my script file, and I run it and I get some error with, and I don't know what's going on. I can now run that with error action break. That's new to PowerShell 7. And so that, I didn't set a breakpoint. I didn't have to go look in the file and look at the error and figure out, you know, I didn't have to read line numbers and character numbers and try to figure out what file that came from and go set breakpoints to figure out what's going on. I just know I hit an error that I wasn't expecting. And so PowerShell version 7 and later now have test error handling error action break. And that puts me on a breakpoint when the error occurs, the moment the error occurs, before it's even surfaced yet to the client. So I can see that get process through an error, and I can look at my help information to refresh my memory on what the commands are, and I can remember, oh yeah, that's right, I want to run list. And so I can see where I was in my code file. And so in terms of a or debugging environment where you're not working with the actual files in front of you, this gets me to the bottom of things very, very, very quickly. So I can look at debug context. Now, this is really, really useful and important at this point, because if you notice, when I ran test error handling error action break, I get thrown into the debugger at an error, but I didn't get the error text, but it's captured. I can actually see the error that happened as the trigger for my debug context. And if I look at that trigger in more detail, it's the actual error record that I would have got surfaced back at the caller level. And so this is really helpful for getting to the bottom of errors in real time rather than after the fact, because you can see what's going on. In fact, I mean, you might want to, you don't have to do this, but you might want to, by the way, I use Q a lot in the debugger, just to basically say, stop running, I'm done, just quit and get me back to the prompt. It doesn't run any more lines of code in my session. I could have hit C to say run to the end, but I often use Q just to get out and say, okay, stop at this point. I'm going to go do some more things and then come back and debug again. Excuse me, I need a drink of water. So yeah, I need more water. So the trigger is really, really important for figuring out what's going on. And if I'm writing a brand new function or a brand new script and I'm troubleshooting it and I want to see what's going on without having to run with - error action break all the time, I might want to set error action preference equals break. And then just while I'm debugging something, some new function I'm running, then I can just run my test error handling function and it'll break on any error that happens inside that function. So this is a good way to, in PowerShell 7, to troubleshoot and figure out what's going on in your scripts. And of course, I mean, I'm saying in PowerShell 7, a lot of the stuff you write in PowerShell 7 will still work in down-level versions of PowerShell depending on what it's doing. So even if you're not using PowerShell 7 yet across your organization, but you've installed it on your system because you can install it side by side with Windows PowerShell, you might want to have that available to leverage some of the better things that are in it, some of the newer functionality, like error action break, just for troubleshooting purposes, that's if your script is compatible with version 7, right? You don't have to have a script that has the newer features. You don't have to make your script so it's not going to run in down level. Obviously, you're going to want to make it work for that if that's a requirement for you. But you can still leverage the newer features in the newer debugger and get into breakpoints more quickly and see what's going on. So just remember that you could do - error action break and look at PS debug context. And if you don't remember the name of that variable, that's fine. Just get variable or debug star, and you'll see that there's PS debug context, and that tells you where it happened, what breakpoints happened, or what breakpoints caused it to happen, and what the trigger was. In case of an error, it triggers the actual error. Now, let's see. Let's debug context and PowerShell 7 error action. Oh yeah, one more thing with error action break. And actually, this is something. So error action breaks we talked about on Twitter, and some people already saw tweets about it being out there. It's actually not just error action break. So in PowerShell, there's all sorts of different streams. There's errors, there's warnings, there's verbose messages, there's information, and progress. And so with all of these streams and debug, with all of these streams, they all have preference handlers. So I can do get variable star preference, and I can see there's, for the various streams, there's the error stream, it's error action preference, and then there's debug preference, information preference, progress, verbose, warning. Those are all what it's going to do, what PowerShell is going to do when a particular type of message occurs. If I go back to my function, and let's say it's not generating the error, but I'm still, something's weird going on, and maybe I'm using right verbose, now I'll. And so I put some verbose messaging in there, and so if I run test error handling with that verbose, I can see that verbose message show up. And if I want it to break when that verbose message shows up, I can set verbose preference, which by default is silently continuous, silencing messages. I can set it to break, and now I can run this again, and I don't even have to use dash verbose in this case. And I'll break on the verbose message. So this break capability comes as part of system management automation action preference, which are the actions you can take when something happens, when a particular type of message is raised, and they include break, continue, ignore, silently continue, stop, and all these different things that you can do to control what's going to happen in your script. So you can use the break on any type of message, and it'll break the moment that message is going to happen, and then continue, and then you'll see your message, and on it goes. And of course, when I do that, if I look at PS debug context trigger, I actually see the verbose message. And that actually is a verbose record, which has properties on it, and so on. And so, yeah, so you can get breakpoints on dynamic breakpointing is what this is really, on any type of message the moment that it happens, which is pretty cool and useful. Because what I'm trying to do with all these things, and I know I'm talking about this in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to do with some of these changes I've been pushing in for PowerShell 7 and some of the changes I plan is I'm trying to make debugging efficient. Because ultimately, people who don't code don't want to spend a lot of time debugging. If you hit an error, you're faced with, okay, I've got to figure out what's going on. And so what do? Do I put in a whole lot of write host calls in my script and to see, okay, got to point A, point B, point C? Or can I leverage the debugger? And can I set breakpoints? And can I get to the bottom of things more quickly? And I try to help people with the debugger side of the fence so that they can learn how to do stepping and setting breakpoints and get to the bottom more easily and be able to use these commands that you see right here. Now, I'm going to jump out of PowerShell 7. Oh, actually, one more thing I'll show you first. And then just a minor thing. I mentioned how I'm trying to bring some of my debug PX stuff forward into PowerShell 7. If I invoke wait debugger in PowerShell 7, it stops on the line. Small thing, but that was necessary for me then to be able to oh, I know why that stopped because of verbose. But yeah, so I'm trying to bring this stuff forward. So now, my next thing I want to do with wait debugger is I want to add the conditional support, so I can do conditional debugging. Where wait debugger shows up is usually in something like jobs, right? Because when you're running something as a background job, there are scenarios where, and this is where code's really wonderful, and you start to really love code. You write this function, you write this script, and you run it. Well, okay, it works great. That's great. I'm going to run that as a background job, and it fails. But it works great locally, but it fails in the job. Why is that? Well, it could be because you have some state in your system, something loaded in your system that's not loaded in your job, something that's in your profile that your job doesn't have, or just various scenarios where things are slightly different and you hit an error. So how do you debug that? Well, you can use wait debugger to force a job to actually wait. And oops, let me just show you what that looks like really quick. You guys usually run this for about an hour, right, for the talk itself? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just about done here. So we're just about at the hour, so that's fine. I just wanted to show jobs because jobs are something that people use commonly enough that it's worthwhile knowing about. So I'm going to start up a couple of jobs in my PowerShell session. Make sure I'm in the right one. Take it back to 5. Yeah. So this is PowerShell version 5. This stuff works there. So all this is doing is taking a couple of scripts that I had on my local system and starting them as jobs. And so I'll do that. And I've got these 2 jobs, they're running. And if you notice them, it says they're both running and they have more data. And now if I look at my jobs again, I can see one of them shows it's at a breakpoint. That happens because the job number 3, the second guy that I ran, had a script that had wait-debugger in it. And so PowerShell enters the breakpoint and waits for me to attach to that job. It's not going to run anymore, so I can see what's going on. So if you are doing background job work with the script and you're trying to figure out what's going on, you can throw wait debugger into your script, rerun it, wait until you get to that breakpoint by looking at your job status, which you can check by capturing the stuff in a variable or by using get-job. And once you are there, then you can debug it. So I can do debug-job ID and job ID number 3. And so when I do that, PowerShell attaches the debugger to the job that was running. And now, notice this is not on the wait debugger call, but if I look at the listing, I can see it's on the line after the wait debugger call. That's because of the way wait debugger was implemented in version 5. And so in version 7, it would actually be on wait debugger on that line 18 waiting for me. But that actually gets me to the debugger to start looking around, checking variables, stepping through code, doing it line by line. And then when I'm done, I can either queue to say, okay, stop the job from running. I've debugged it, found an issue, I want to fix it, and then rerun the job. Or I can realize, oh, that's really not a problem. I can let it keep on going, in which case I can use C to continue execution of that job, and it'll keep on running. Actually, I shouldn't use just C, because C will keep it running while I'm attached. Notice when I used debug job, my prompt changed to I'm in the debugger and I'm in a job. And the reason why it says job 4, not job 3, just so you know, is whenever you create a job, 2 jobs are created, a parent job and a child job. And so job 1 has a child job, job 2. Job 3 has a child job, job 4. The child jobs are the ones that have the scripts. And so this is job number 4 that I'm debugging under job ID number 3. It's just smart enough to figure out where that's what's on the breakpoint when I connect to it and bring me in the right spot. And then when I'm done, if I was running this local and I wanted to continue execution, I would use C to continue. But since I'm running it remotely and I've attached my debugger to it, inside of here, one command I didn't talk about too much is detach. Detach is when you're attaching to something remotely and you want to get it back to your regular prompt. And so I just detached, and now when I look at my jobs, they're both running, and they'll keep on running because I detached. So actually technically the fact that the second one is still running is a bug because it still has a wait debugger in it. And so anytime it hits wait debugger, it should stop on a breakpoint, not just keep on running. So technically that one's a bug. But if I didn't use wait debugger, actually, I'll show you that scenario too really quick. So debug job ID1. ID1, this job is a script that does not have wait debugger in it. And maybe it's taking a long time. I don't want to see what's going on or where it is and check out what's happening. I can debug that job even though it's got no wait debugger. And what PowerShell is going to do is the moment that it's able to connect, it'll connect me to that job, whatever line it happens to be running at the time. And I can look around and I can step through my code. And so if I step a few times and I look again, I can see I've stepped into other lines in my code. And so, so you can debug jobs that don't have wait debugger, and then, okay, it's fine. It was just taking a while, but I can see it's still running. That's good. I'll detach and let it keep on running, and then just do it. It's work until it's done. So when you have long-running jobs, it's good to know that you can hop into them with the debugger, look around, not change anything, and then jump back out by disconnecting, and all you're doing is peeking under the hood. You're not hurting its execution at all. It's not going to run differently. So, and that's jobs. So I'm just going to actually get the off that. Whoops. Up. So I got those jobs gone. So that was pretty much all I wanted to do during this talk as far as demonstration goes. One thing I will call out is, and this is a place where you guys can contribute. PowerShell is open source. And so there are issues and there are RFCs open about errors and error handling and how to make error handling better and how to make debugging better. And if you want to participate in those discussions, you're more than welcome to. You just need a GitHub account and then you can participate in the discussions. One key thing I'll call out is, so Jason Hilmick, and the newest PM on the PowerShell team, I think he's still the newest. Anyway, he's got an RFC for updating the error view with simplified views, because that's the red error text problem. Too much information, line numbers when there don't need to be any, it's all red. How do we make it so it's easier for people to figure out what's going on when an error happens? That's what this is about. And if you want to see what he's proposed, you browse into this URL, or you browse PowerShell RFC, the repo. So PowerShell, github.com/PowerShell /PowerShell-RFC, under pull requests, right now the very first one is Jason's error review, but you can just search for it using the filter here for error review. Get to the actual RFC, and then to actually look at it and see what's going on, you have to go into the files changed to see what files he's changed. And he's got this update error review file, and it shows you by default in a diff format. But if you're just reading it and you want to see what's going on, don't look at it in this format at first because it's got comments and it's a little hard to figure out. Just come over here to the right-hand corner, click the ... view file, and that shows you a rendered version with proper headings of what their plan is. Read through this if you care about errors and you care about the fact that errors can be hard to manage. See what they have proposed, and then share your comments and let them know what you think. And the way you share those comments, just so you're aware, is you just go back from the view and over the conversation tab, and you can leave feedback at the bottom of the conversation just by coming in here and saying whatever, saying it's great, saying you like it, saying you want something, you think they're doing something not quite right, all that stuff. Future possibilities I am working that are likely. So the error review handling is very likely to go in PowerShell 7. Being able to manage breakpoints in run spaces and jobs from your current session. Right now, you can't do set-ps breakpoint on a certain command. So set ps breakpoint -command get process -job, whatever job. You can't do that. That doesn't work yet. But that's something I would like to see happen. I think that's likely that we'll start seeing that's possible in version 7 or later. And then there's some other stuff coming along the lines of what's called just my code debugging, because when you're running PowerShell and everything is open source and interpreted, you might be running modules that you downloaded from the internet that you don't use, and you don't want to step through them because you want to debug your own code, but you're calling those functions, and so they can get in the way of your debugging experience. There's this notion of just my code debugging that's being talked about within the PowerShell space to make it so that it knows that. So it can tell, oh, you installed these things and obviously those come from other sources versus your own code that you wrote and you want to debug that. And so it'll do the right thing and not debug through code that's installed. And then debugging bug fixes and pipelining support for wait debugger, conditional support for wait debugger, and there's a lot more debugger functionality that I'm hoping to push in 7 or later. But that's kind of a high-level flyby introduction to PowerShell debugging. Questions, comments?
Good session.
Was this technically, was it deeper than you would like me to have gone for introductory, or was this pretty good for? Yeah. Okay.
This is great. I personally, I've been using PowerShell for quite a while. I had no idea that any of the debugging stuff was there. So this is really great, really interesting for me.
Cool. If you start tinkering with it, you're going to find it'll save you so much time in terms of figuring out where things are going. And once you start experimenting with the breakpoints and just getting to the right issue faster. I mean, even that last thing I showed you for PowerShell 7 with error action break, it's in preview, but you can install the preview today. And so if you want to leverage that and start playing with that, you can just go ahead and install the preview side by side with Windows PowerShell and just tinker with it for learning the debugging experience. And if you run one of your scripts and it fails, and you want to try it again from PowerShell 7 with -error action break and see if that helps you out, that would be great feedback for PowerShell, for the team, to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to, for people to try it out and see how it works and share feedback, as well as getting you into the debugger at the right location more quickly.
Great. Kirk, thank you very much.
You're welcome. If you guys have questions that come up about your debugging experiences too after the fact, feel free just to tag me on Twitter or find me on the Slack channel, because I'm on Slack on PowerShell as well, using the same nickname, Pashaholic there. And just, find me in one of the online channels that I hang out in, and come ask me questions, and don't be shy about it. I'll do what I can to help.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.